Well, Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this morning.
Terrific to be with you. Thank you.
So, I wanted to start with the work of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at the King's College in London, which you work with a lot. Why was it founded and what do they do?
It was founded basically because there is a gap in the global knowledge base about how to make a difference for women coming through their careers into the upper echelons and into leadership. And this gap became apparent to me when I left politics and I sat down to write my first book called My Story, which was about my time in politics. And I wanted to write really thoughtfully on the question of gender. And to do that, I didn't want to just, write a narrative about this happened to me, this happened to me. I wanted to look more broadly at what was known about the way that people perceive women leaders, how much of that's still done through the prism of gender, what can we do to change all of that. And when I looked around at what's out there in the research base, there's some incredible material, no doubt about that, but there's some still very big gaps and holes in the evidence space. We don't know everything we need to about how gender impacts leadership, and we certainly don't have the complete toolkit about how to change it. And so I was invited to go to King's College London for a visiting professorship. And when I was there, I put to them the idea that, look, I think there is genuinely this, void to be filled. Could we work together and do that? And that led to the creation of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership.
Yeah. And you've kind of already answered this, but I thought I'd put it out there again anyway. Having more female leaders it's a huge talked about topic, especially now. But it's such an important issue, and it's something that you're obviously very passionate about and you work in a lot for. But what drives you to make it such a priority?
Well, firstly, I've always been energised by the feminist cause. Would have described myself as a feminist, continue to describe myself as a feminist, but would have first started describing myself as a feminist when I was a university student way back when, so that's quite a long time ago now. And it's always been of concern to me that we continue to live in a world where men and women have differential chances and opportunities in life, that we don't live in a gender equal world. And against that backdrop of always wanting to make a difference for women and women's equality, my own experiences at a leadership level have sort of very much embedded in me that this is a cause that I can make a contribution to. I've had a unique insight because there are so few women leaders in the world. There aren't too many people who can say, I've lived it, I've been there, and now I want to make a contribution to the journey of change. So between my broad belief in feminism and the very specific life experiences I've had, it's come together to really propel me into this work with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership.
Yeah, in Australia, the only woman to be so high up as well. So that, take unique and then make it uniquer. Well done.
Well, thank you for that. And if it was just Australia and we could look at other countries and say they've all got it sorted, that would be one thing. But the global statistics are truly eye-wateringly bad. If you look at the countries around the world who pick their leader, obviously not everywhere does, but of the countries that do, fully 70% have never had a woman be president or prime minister in whatever the top political job is in their system. And it's only a very limited number of countries that have had more than one woman. That's down at 13 as a number. And there's only two countries in the world that have had a woman 3 times. New Zealand's one and Iceland is the other. So we've got a lot to do.
Absolutely. And 70%, it's a huge statistic, isn't it? And the way that you're speaking globally, it does kind of lead nicely into the next question. Looking at, global education, this is something else that you're very, very passionate about. And, it's very important for you. And you can see that through your work with CamFed, which is the Campaign for Female Education, and the Global Partnership for Education. Now, you've spoken a lot about leadership, but why is education such a big issue for you as well?
I think life's chances are basically defined in the early years, and that belief, once again, has been with me all of my life. I got a fantastic quality education at the local government schools that I went to in my community in South Australia, but I always viewed getting that education and then getting the opportunity to go on to university as a real privilege. Neither of my parents had finished secondary school, so this was unusual in our family and not to be wasted. And here in Australia, when I was in politics, I didn't want anybody's life chances determined on a kind of postcode lottery of whether you lived in a suburb with a good school or whether the school that you went to was struggling. And unfortunately, when we do demographic data in Australia, we can say that there are communities where life's chances aren't equal and aren't fair, and that the quality of education available is not good enough. And so many of the things we did on school quality, on school funding, were about that. And when I left politics, I wanted to try and make a contribution on that globally. So the Global Partnership for Education is the big multilateral fund that supports school education in developing countries. So I'm talking about places where, you know, the access challenge isn't solved yet, where kids just don't go to school, or many of them don't go to school, the most marginalised. And it also led me to the Campaign for Female Education, which is a fantastic scholarship model for girls in Africa that really empowers them and stays with them as they make the transition into adulthood.
It's interesting what you say about the fact that neither of your parents finished their high school education, and that was something that you did, and it wasn't to be wasted. I mean, when I think of not wasting an education, I think you've done pretty well. You know, you've taken it to the next level for all of us. I mean,
Thank you.
this is this is something really interesting, and I know you've been questioned about this a lot, but your misogyny speech in Parliament, I feel like this is kind of when you ask, you know, if you ask a musician about their number one hit back in the day over and over again, but I had to ask it. I mean, this speech, it's been remixed, it's been used as a karaoke track, it was arranged into a choir piece, and earlier this year it was voted the most unforgettable moments of Australian TV history. Did you realize how important this was going to be when you were giving it, or even before you were giving it?
No, not at all. No insight into any of that at all, even when I'd finished giving it. When I finished giving it on that day in Parliament, I knew that it had been a powerful speech in the parliamentary chamber. You can tell
Yes.
from the reactions of the opposition, the reactions of your own side. So I knew that it had been a powerful speech in that kind of arena. But I didn't have any insight into how it would translate beyond that arena and how it would endure over time. So if you'd said to me 5 minutes later, after I'd given the speech, you know, you'll still be talking about that in 2020, I would have said, no, that's ridiculous. That won't happen. And yet here we are. And yes, we're still talking about it.
We're still talking about it literally right now. And I was watching the really interesting chat you had with Hillary Clinton a little while ago, and you said that when you were talking about this speech, that you just wrote down notes. Like there was a plan, but it was a lot of just kind of on the moment thing. I mean, I don't know. It was such a, as you can, like, you know, as it's been transferred, it's such a powerful speech. I mean, when you just have notes and when you're speaking that, I mean, how do you kind of get yourself to that point that you're able to give a speech like that?
Well, there are some things about that speech that were completely instantaneous, and then some things, I guess, measured in years. I mean, what was instantaneous is I didn't expect on that day in Parliament to be giving a speech. I expected to go into the Parliament and to have the back and forth of question time. So get asked a question, give an answer. And it was only when I got into the parliamentary chamber that the opposition moved to have a debate, and they spoke first because they moved the motion. So Tony Abbott spoke first, and then I only had the time of his speech to get myself ready to give that speech. So I had with me sort of quotes of his that I had been intending to use in question time. But the speech itself, I gave off handwritten notes I made as he was speaking. And actually, those handwritten notes are the inside front cover of the hard copy book, My Story. And everybody can see just how bad my handwriting is. Um, but measured in years in this sense that, you know, I'd been in politics at that point for a number of years, and, you know, the essence of honing your craft in the parliamentary chamber is, you know, learning to stand your ground, to respond in the moment, to respond with force. So when women say to me, oh, I could never give a speech like that, I'm always keen to say, you know, these skills aren't innate, they're learned skills. You know, I was in politics for 15 years all up, and was I much better at giving a speech towards the end than I was at the beginning? Absolutely. So could I have given that speech in my first year in the parliamentary chamber? No, because I hadn't honed the craft. And at the same time, though, I think I couldn't have given a speech like that if I'd had days and days of preparation. There is something about the immediacy of it that has helped it resonate with people.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that I've always kind of found so inspiring about that particular moments of your career, because there are so many speeches and there's so many speech makers and so many speech writers, and in 8 years this is the speech that you made that we still talk about. And yeah, I think that's exactly right. The immediacy and the passion that comes from that is amazing. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about your book very briefly that you recently released, Women in Leadership. Amazing book. Most people I know have it, or it's on their Christmas list, or they're trying to download it on Audible or something like that. And there are a bunch of different incredible things that you can take from that book. But I wanted to talk about the really strong message toward the end of the book, which is be aware, not beware. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I decided with my co-author, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, that we were going to write this book, one of the things that we were very concerned about, thoughtful about, is we knew that we would be examining leadership from the dimension of gender, and we knew that meant that we'd be putting in all sorts of statistics like the one we've discussed today, which would depress people. We would be putting in all sorts of psychological research, which would mean people would know more about how people view women leaders, and a lot of that is not good news. And we, in knowing that, didn't want the message of the book to be a negative one. We ultimately, both Ngozi and I, are big believers that we want women to go for it, to go for leadership, whether that be politics, business, the media, civil society, the law, technology, whatever area of life is the pathway you want to walk. We want women to aspire. And so to reinforce that at the end of the book, we talked about being aware that your leadership will still be viewed in today's world, and likely for a number of years to come, with gender at the forefront of how people see you. But don't be put off. Don't beware. Don't say to yourself, oh, because of that, I'm not going to do it. Instead, do it, but perhaps war game in advance what these things might mean and the strategies for dealing with them, so that you are never blindsided at any point.
Yeah, it's a great message, I think, for life. I don't want to be cheesy, but I mean, it is kind of like a nice, there's something really nice that kind of resonates with, you know, going forward for life, you know, being prepared, but not being terrified of not moving forward, I think.
Yes, and you know, we do in the book actually look at research about role modelling, and you know, our concerns were rational ones. They were inherent to us, but the more we looked at the research, the more it struck us that unless you get this role modelling and messaging right, you can put people off. So the research on role modelling definitely says that if a woman leader speaking to other women to encourage them basically says, oh, you know, I've never had any troubles, I've always been able to get it together, none of this has ever worried me, then the women listening to her will be put off because they'll say to themselves internally, she's superwoman, like I could never be like that. But by the same token, if the woman comes along and says, you know, it's really hard, it's really brutal, it's really destructive, then the women listening will be put off, because why would I want to go into that game? And so for us, actually talking about the joys, the privileges of leadership, the things that you get to do, we wanted to make sure we put a big spotlight on that, as well as helping women think in advance about how they're going to deal with the gendered bit.
And role modeling it's so important, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because I mean, for a lot of people, especially of my generation and people like me and my younger sister, I mean, you've been a role model for a lot of us, especially in terms of leadership. And I wanted to know, is there a role model for you? I mean, especially when you were first starting out, that you kind of looked up to the way that we kind of look up to you in a way?
There certainly was. I was at that stage in Victoria, so I grew up in South Australia, but I moved to Melbourne because I became ever more involved in the student movement, and I ended up Vice President, then President of the Australian Union of Students. And through all of that, I got to know a young man, also a university student, called Dave Kerner. And lo and behold, his mum was Joan Kerner, who went on to be the first woman to lead the state of Victoria. So I actually had a kind of ringside seat for the things that happened to her. You know, I knew her personally. It wasn't just watching a politician on a far stage, but because of this connection with Dave, I knew her and I knew the family. And so that was a real privilege and made a very big impact on me. And she sort of stayed a very big part of my life for the rest of her life.
Yeah, wow. That's I mean, what an amazing like personal connection to have, especially like in terms of like leadership as well. I think that's kind of all fell the right way in a way.
It did. It did. It was, I mean, Joan and, you know, the women who were leading the way in Australian politics, I guess, were always going to be role models for me. But I was especially lucky that I had this personal connection.
We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with your book, but so you're the chair of Beyond Blue, and I wanted to know, what was it about your time in Parliament and previously that made mental health such a priority issue for you?
Well, that goes right back to my early days here in Adelaide growing up. My father was a psychiatric nurse, and so talking about psychiatry, psychology, mental illness was just inherent in our household because it was Dad's job, you know, and you'd have all of the usual conversations you have about how was work today, but his work was in a mental health hospital.
Mm.
So you know, fast forwarding the clock, when I was in Parliament, then, you know, in the Labor Party, in the Shadow Ministry, I was Shadow Minister for Health for a period, and we announced Labor's first ever mental health plan. The government in that election campaign after us also announced a mental health plan. So I'd had this connection with the issue of mental health and mental health coming to the policy forefront. When we're in government, we tried to make a difference to mental health, but I knew that there was much more that needed to be done. So when Jeff Kennett approached me and the opportunity came to chair Beyond Blue, I thought that's a perfect fit for me with that history, and knowing that, you know, there's growing community awareness, which is fantastic, but that also means that there's growing community need for services. Beyond Blue itself provides services. We innovate to show what could be done to better the mental health system, and we advocate for change in the system. So I'm doing that work with the team at Beyond Blue now. And of course, during this COVID pandemic era, the focus on mental health and the need for services has been almost more than any other time I think people can remember.
Oh, absolutely. And that was what I was going to ask you. I mean, that we've had, you know, we're in a pandemic. There's and there's kind of been this other pandemic as such of mental health. And that was predicted by experts when, as soon as the suggestion of lockdown came in. But I was wondering, you know, from your experience of working so closely with of chairing Beyond Blue, and then also having this connection with a deeper understanding of mental health for your whole life, really. How do you think that the last 8 months is going to kind of affect our concept, but also maybe our experience of mental health and mental health services in Australia?
I'm hoping that there are some things we can take beyond the crisis, which will actually give us a better outlook on mental health and a better system of service provision. I mean, one thing that I'm thankful for is that we are all talking about mental health. I mean, I genuinely think if this pandemic had happened, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that people would have been talking as much as we are about the physical health crisis, but we would not have been talking about mental health in the same way. So that reinforces in me that a lot has changed, that people are much more open about talking about mental health, much more thoughtful about their own mental health, and the fact that people are reaching out in record numbers to Beyond Blue support services shows that people are not only having the conversation, they're prepared to take positive action to safeguard and support their mental health. I hope we take all of that with us, informed by how much attention we put on it during the days of the pandemic. And then I'm also hoping we take with us what we've learned about telehealth services. Beyond Blue for a long period of time has been advocating for more service provision using technology. The workforce, the clinical workforce that deals with mental health tends to be in our big cities. It can be hard for people to get services in the outer suburbs, in regional towns, in the rural locations. And we've been saying in a country like ours, telehealth has to be part of the solution. And now it's demonstrated it can work, it is working. So that, I think, needs to be part of the future.
So hopefully some positives to take out of such a big year.
Yeah, it's been a big, and it's still in progress, a big hard year. And for so many people, this will be remembered as a time of grief, of anxiety, of huge economic loss. So there's a lot of tough things for people to get through, but hopefully we can take some lessons with us that make us, stronger for the future.
Mm. There's been many things that can and has defined your career as the Prime Minister and also as a leader. But for me, and I think many others would agree with me, the thing that comes to mind is resilience. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of you as a leader and in your career. And, you had, to put it kind of badly, you had a bit of a rough run with, from parliamentary members to the Australian press to protesters, amongst a lot of other things. I mean, there was a lot to overcome to be able to continue on. And I wanted to know, what do you think has kind of helped you develop that resilience, and what has kept you going?
What has always kept me going is a sense of purpose about, what I want to do in the world, what I want to spend my life's time doing. I was very lucky in the sense that I found that abiding sense of purpose early in my life. I went to university, I got involved in advocacy, I got involved in the cause of education, and that was always energising and sustaining for me. And so that sense of purpose saw me through the highs and the lows in politics. So for anyone, I think, knowing, what your true north is helps steady you. And for me, I did find that early. Obviously, some people take a long time to find it, but I found it early. And then in terms of resilience, I kind of think that this is a muscle you can work. It does grow stronger. You can be thoughtful about the early, smaller challenges that you face in life, about how you're going to respond, about how you're going to, get yourself back up. And if you do that time after time, then I think you can tolerate the bigger challenges and the greatest stresses. So intuitively, I think I did a lot of things that through Beyond Blue, I now see is the kind of express advice we give people about how to foster resilience. And there's no one big silver bullet. It's not if you do X, then you will always be fine in a crisis. It's not like that. It's about the small things that you can do to keep yourself healthy in a physical sense, to keep yourself rested, to have the sort of social capital, the connections, family, friends, community that can help sustain you.
You've been a leader for many years now. I mean, talking about your political years, you said 15 years, and then you've gone on to continuing leadership and be very passionate. But as you said, you started your political career and your leadership career really quite early. What do you wish you knew back then that you know today?
Well, I certainly wish I knew all of the things about gender that we've now written in the book. I wish I had the book back then, because I made some naive assumptions that I would be living out most of my life and most of my career in a much more gender equal world than we have now. So I would have liked the forearmed, forewarned kind of perspective that we do try and give to others through the book.
And do you have advice for young women in 2020, specifically those who are going into leadership roles in the future?
Well, number one piece of advice is go for it. Absolutely. I want to see women in leadership roles everywhere. Number two, when things happen to you and you're trying to think through what of this is me, what of this is because I'm a woman, and you're finding that a perplexing question, do reach out for advice, do look at the evidence sources that are available. Obviously, much of it's in the book, but that's not the only way of getting access to that evidence and material. And, don't internalize it. Don't take it as it's all negative about you. Actually look at the gender dynamic and then reach out to other women, to supporters who can help you war game how to deal with that.
Julia, you've been really generous with your time. Thank you so much for talking with me this morning.
Thank you. Great to speak with you.